Okay, I was trying to unmute myself, but I'll just use the space bar. I'm really happy to have Ron back here tonight. It seems like ages since he's presented to us, though he has presented to us on a number of occasions before. Excuse me, both at our Delta Natural Society meetings, but he also was a participant in at least one, and I think it was probably two, Birds in Focus visual presentations. With one or two, Ron? Two. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, so wonderful presentations. Ron was the scientist photographer at Simon Fraser University for 36 years. So he has a great deal of biology in his background and became interested in native plants in the 70s. He's photographed approximately half of the flowering plants in BC, about 1,000 species. That is quite amazing. His interest in native plants led directly to his efforts to preserve the flora of Pink Mountain. And those were two of the presentations that Ron did to us, one on Pink Mountain many years ago, and then one not that long ago, an update on Pink Mountain. Now that he's retired, he's traveling to nature hotspots all over the place. Southern Africa, 6 times. South America 8 times, Western Australia, and numerous trips around Western US and Canada. He's a past president of the Native Plant Society, and he coordinates the annual photography competition for Nature Vancouver. And he's a pretty darn good photographer himself. So I'm really looking forward to this presentation, and I'm sure you all are too. So let's let Ron get to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I've been looking forward to doing this particular presentation as well, because as Elizabeth mentioned, I've done quite a bit of traveling since I retired, and most of those trips were looking at plants, but Western Australia was far and away the best plant hunting trip that I have done in terms of the numbers of plants and and just the really interesting plants. So I'm really hoping that you will find this as exciting as I still do every time I look at it. So we'll go to this. It's a fairly long program. There's a lot to include. So I'm going to start it here and get going.
Perfect, Ron.
Good. And as you will see, this this title is quite literal. So a little bit of background on Western Australia. British Columbia is about.
South America
Sorry, what was that?
seems to be upside down.
Oh, it is. Well, yeah, thanks for pointing that out. BC is about 400,000 square miles, pretty big province, but Western Australia is just under 1 million square miles. So it's includes almost 1/3 of Australia, and it's the largest state or province in the world. It's bigger than Texas and Alaska combined, as well as all these countries you can see on this map. Now we're going to be spending quite a bit of our time in the Southwest Botanical Province, and this one area has 1/4 of all the plants in Australia. They're giving a number of 6,759, but as you're going to see, there is so much work still to be done on the botany of Western Australia that number is really just a guesstimate. And almost half of those that are known are endemic to this Southwest Botanical Province. It's important to realize that Australia is in the southern hemisphere, so that it gets colder towards the south. And that means the flower bloom begins in the north. And so that's where we wanted to start our trip. I was traveling with my botanist friend, Dave Williams from Kamloops. We flew into Perth. And one of the most valuable things I learned before I made the trip was that although there are many small towns throughout Western Australia, there's only the one city, Perth, and a few larger towns, but very few. Most of them are small towns that have no tourist accommodation at all. But they do all have good campground facilities, or there they call them caravan parks. So we planned on renting an RV, which we picked up in Perth and then headed north. I had chosen Exmouth, that you can see up at the top there, as our first destination, particularly because there is a reef attached to the shoreline at Exmouth, so you can walk into the water off the beach and snorkel on the reef, which is something I wanted to do. So that was our first objective. Western Australia has more road space per capita than any place else in the world, and the population is very scattered. So you see few cars on the road, but it wasn't long before we encountered one of the Australian icons, and that is a road train. I've heard about these things, expected them to be on back roads, but no, they're on every road. And these things are enormous. They can be 180 feet long. They can weigh 80 to 120 tons. They travel so fast, you get the impression that they're barely under control. And they're just intimidating to be anywhere near. And shortly, we encountered a much more pleasant icon, and that is the gray kangaroo. The joeys stay in the pouch for about a year or until the next joey is born. But what I found interesting is that a female kangaroo can be feeding a joey in the pouch and also one out of the pouch. Inside the pouch, there are 4 teats that provide 2 different kinds of milk for the different stages of development. Kangaroos are most active in the early morning and late afternoon. During the heat of the day, they relax. They really know how to relax. On land, both feet can only move together, but when they're swimming, the feet move independently. Interesting adaptation. They can travel up to 40 miles an hour, cover 25 feet in a bound, and clear obstacles 10 feet high. They're quiet and gentle and attractive. They make beautiful pets, which has to do with this. There's not nearly enough warning signs along the roads. Kangaroos are killed by the hundreds. Virtually every place we stopped along a road to look at plants, we encountered dead kangaroos in various stages of decay. There's so many kangaroo collisions that there's this ubiquitous auto accessory called rhubars. And you see them on cars, on motorhomes, on buses and trucks. And these are all to protect the vehicle from collisions with kangaroos. There are many Australians, I learned, that if they see a freshly killed kangaroo along the road, they will actually stop and check the pouch to see if there's a joey still alive. And the kangaroo you're seeing on the screen is Roxy. She's a pet at one of the caravan parks we stayed at, and just a beautiful animal. Another park owner had rescued 10 joeys and raised them. They grew up, went off and had joeys of their own. So he now has 40 kangaroos regularly coming to his property. Anyway, we're supposed to be looking at plants, so let's go. I thought the ouch bush was a good place to start because it seems to me that just about everything there either pricks, sticks, or bites. You very quickly learn not to reach out from behind the camera to move a twig out of your view, because it's almost certainly going to hurt. Even seemingly regular leaves have spines. Almost immediately, we started finding flowers, and this was one of our early finds. And fortunate that we found it, because this was the only time and place that we saw it. The red and green kangaroo paw is the state flower of Western Australia. There's 24 species in the genus, and we'll see a couple more a little bit later on. So beautiful flowers, just so many. Western Australia has an estimated 13,000 plant species, but that's just a guess. They have 3,000 that have been collected, but so far have not been officially named. So it just goes on and on. This I found interesting because recent research has shown that as we all know, there are plants that require heat to release the seeds. Well, what they're finding now is that in many cases, both heat and smoke, the chemicals in the smoke, are required to break seed dormancy. And this is another smoke responsive plant. These are tiny flowers, less than a centimeter high. The species name revoluta means rolled back, and referring to the petals and sepals that you can see here. There are a lot of everlastings, and some of them produce pretty spectacular mass displays. And those mass displays attract a lot of visitors. But if you only go there to look at the mass displays, you're missing most of what there is to find. There are so many other interesting plants, but you have to spend the time. You have to get out and you have to walk around. The general flora is dominated by shrubs, and there are hundreds of them. In this genus alone, there's 65 species. Another of the same genus. This one was interesting because the anthers turn red after they've been pollinated. This saves time for future pollinators. They don't waste their time visiting flowers that have already been taken care of. So from the plant's point of view, this makes pollination much more efficient. And this plant is endemic to Western Australia. Calatrix, over 70 species in the genus. The verticordias, 111 plus species. Remember, these are all shrubs that we're looking at so far. In fact, there's so many shrubs that the guidebooks don't even attempt to cover them. So for quite a few plants, we just have to enjoy them for their anonymous beauty. But without being a professional botanist, there's just no way to identify them. Now, you might think that you could just sort of stop anywhere and find plants, but that's not the case. There's hundreds of miles where there really is not much to see. But fortunately, the Tourism Board of Western Australia publishes a wildflower guide every year, and the guide divides the wildflower area into specific trails. So depending on just where you are at a given time, you go to the section in the guide for that trail, and there you'll find a map with numbered dots. And each one of those dots indicates a point of special interest. And then elsewhere on the page, there'll be a short paragraph telling you what to look for at that location. And this was an enormous help to us. But we also realized that it wasn't enough, that we needed local information. And the guide also helped with that. See the advertisement in the lower right? That's an advertisement for a campground, a caravan park. But what interested us was that they're advertising guided flower walks. That's just what we needed. So we spent a couple of days at this park, and that was when we really got started to seeing flowers. But we're continuing north, and after about 3 days on the road, I think it was into our third day, we crossed an invisible line around here, and the flowers disappeared. North of that line, there was virtually no flowers to be seen. No flowering shrubs, no flowers. Just hundreds of miles of scrub. We did see for the first time the red kangaroo, which is at 2 meters tall, is the largest marsupial in the world. And we also saw quite a number of emus. These are pretty impressive birds, of course, flightless and huge. The very occasional farm, I guess there's just not that much arable land. As I say, mostly scrub, and in many areas dominated by these huge termite mounds. We did see a few birds, the red-tailed cockatoo, the gala, and the crested pigeon. And what to me is the bird with the most suitable name that I have ever come across. This is called the splendid wren. It doesn't get much more splendid than that. We were there in the dry season. In the wet, this river would be flowing full. And in fact, alongside, they have a flood gauge that records the water level in different years. And so, man, there's a lot of water there. On the roads, they don't bother to put culverts in the low areas. They just provide you with a flood gauge, so you know how deep the water is that you're going to be driving through. And because of that, another common accessory on vehicles is a snorkel. And this allows the engine to continue to run even if it's completely submerged. And you can see on this big truck, he could drive through water that was higher, as high as his windshield. So you got to understand that Western Australia is a very macho society. And so the typical guy there, his vehicle looks like this: extra big spotlights on the front, the roo bars, four-wheel drive, of course, and the snorkel. So we reached Exmouth. It was everything I hoped for: a beautiful white sandy beach, crystal clear tropical water. We spent a couple of days snorkeling here, and I even took a few underwater pictures. This is a starfish. But when we weren't in the water, we were still looking for flowers, and surprisingly, we found a few late flowering species, including this one. And this is another iconic plant. This is the Stewart's Desert Pea. Appears in almost every publication about Western Australian plants, named for Charles Stewart, who was an Australian explorer. We also found fringe lilies for the first time. And you would think it would be pretty intimidating trying to learn all of these plants. But pretty quickly, we twigged to the fact that there was large groups of plants that shared common characteristics, like the fringes on the petals of this one. So we could pretty quickly recognize that this is a fringe lily and know where to go in our plant guides. We picked up every plant guide that we came across. And so it was not a matter of having to page through it one page at a time. We could just look up fringe lilies in the index, and since there's 47 species of these, that's quite a few very distinctive species. And there are many groups of plants that do have similar characteristics that we could quickly learn. We also had our first encounter with sundews here. Sundews are very important in Western Australia, and I'm going to have more to say about them later. So we spent a few days at Exmouth, less than a week, and we're heading back south again. So we get back to the line where the flowers disappeared, fully expecting to start seeing flowers again. There weren't any. We discovered that the flower line in those few days had moved hundreds of miles to the south. So now it's way down at the bottom of the province, with one exception. Near the town of Mullewa, and between Mullewa and Morawa, it's only a 60-mile stretch, but there was something different about that particular area. There were so many plants, so many flowers to be seen in that stretch of road that it took us a full day to cover 60 miles. And one of the plants that we found was just, it's just spectacular. The wreath flower. This is another one of those icons that you see in publications regularly. This plant is so sought after that there are permanent signs along the highway pointing to wreath flower sites. But of course, the signs are up there year round, but if you're there at the wrong time, you're not going to find them. But we had much more local information on the washroom building of our campground. They call it the ablution block. There was this hand-lettered sign that directed us to a nearby cluster of wreath flowers. And sure enough, there they were. And just take note, there is nobody else there. We've got the whole place to ourselves. The species name is macrantha, from the Greek makros, which means large, and anthos, which means a flower, referring to the particularly large flowers of this particular species. Here's another species in that genus. The species name here, Formosa, means beautiful. And the third, the genus is Leschenoltia, named for a botanist named, gosh sakes, what a handle, Jean-Baptiste Leschenol de la Tour. Excuse my bad French. So we're just now back into shrubs in this area. The grevilleas, another large group that is easy to recognize because they have very similar characteristics to the flowers, and this genus can be anything from small to large shrubs, and they're related to the proteas of South Africa, which is interesting. That relationship must go back to when Africa and Australia were connected. The toothbrushes, just not difficult to see where that name came from. The Grevillea genus has so far 234 identified species and innumerable subspecies. So, man, the botany of Western Australia is just so complex. Darwinia, not named for Charles Darwin, it's named for his father. And this is a genus of between 30 and 60. There's another indication, they just don't know, 30 to 60 species of evergreen shrubs. So second Darwinia. Driving through the small towns, it's easy to see that the wildflowers are significant because they many of them have advertised wildflowers on their on the signs at the entrance to the town. Just notice the tiny dark spots. Those are the flowers. And lambswool, what a perfect name, because the white is just like cotton, and such a pure white. Beautiful. The genus name is accurate. This is an early flowering plant. The genus names means dawn flower, but the English name morning iris is almost completely wrong. Well, the morning part is accurate, but it's certainly not an iris. But that shows the weakness of common names in plants. On the other hand, the common name here is pretty appropriate. White candles, yeah. So one of the common things of every one of these small towns was they each had a visitor center. And we took to stopping at the visitor center as soon as we reached a new town. And these were all kind of the experts, the local experts were all retired people. And so this one was pretty typical of our reception. First thing we do is when we reach the town, Wangan Hills, we pull into the visitor center. We walk in the door. There's a gray-haired lady and a gray-haired man there. And before we open our mouths, we're seated at a table. We've each had a plate of cookies and a cup of tea put in front of us. And now, how can we help you? Well, we're from Canada and we're interested in wildflowers. Well, that was just the most special thing to them. We come all the way from Canada just to look at their flowers. So the man gets up and goes to the phone, and within the hour, he had the local wildflower guide, the local wildflower photographer, and come down to the visitor center to meet us. And we were out in the field with the two most knowledgeable people in the area, all because of the wonderful welcome we got at all of these visitor centers. But we're trying to catch up with the bloom now. And now we've left the Morowa area, and we're just in a 3-day dash to try to catch up with the flowers. Now, once again, the flower guide gave us some hope that we weren't too late. There's another advertisement in there for the Ongerup wildflower display, and it gave the dates, and we were still within those dates. So we're headed for Ongerup. I'm literally not stopping, just driving all day. We got to the town. We found the wildflower display. There was an older lady there looking after it, and she had her 4 grandkids with her. This display was really well done. They're all fresh plants that have been collected in the field, including orchids. There are so many orchids that they don't hesitate to cut them, to put them in the display. And when they start to fade, they just go out and collect more of the same. So they immediately could put us on to where to start finding plants. And we ended up staying here for several days because there was so much to do. But late each afternoon, we would come back to the museum where the wildflower display was. The kids were always there. And we would show the kids a picture of one of the flowers that we'd photographed. And it turned out to be a really helpful game, helpful to us. The kids would look at the picture and then go off into the display and find that plant. So we were able to identify it. So the kids had fun, and we gained some names. But we finally start finding orchids. This particular one is one of the first 3 orchids to be described from Western Australia. It was collected by Archibald Menzies in 1791. He was the botanist with Captain Vancouver, and they stopped at Australia before they came to our coast. Now, I said earlier that the general flora is dominated by flowering shrubs, but the herbaceous flora, if you can believe this, the herbaceous flora is dominated by orchids. This is one of a group that's called donkey orchids for obvious reasons. And once again, they're easy to identify, at least to genus, because they all have the donkey ears. The enamel orchids are well named. The petals are so glossy, they look exactly like they've been coated in enamel. There's only 2 species in this genus, and I managed to find both of them. Joseph's spider orchid, it's the reference is to Joseph's coat of many colors, because these flowers are variable in color. The spider orchid reference is pretty obvious. Now, realize, just notice that these are all Caladienias in the genus Caladienia. So we have very different looking plants, all in Caladienia. Caladienia again. Dragon orchid is named for that dark structure on the lip. Caladienia. They're so different. I kind of object to this being called a common spider orchid. I mean, it just doesn't seem right to call any orchid common. So we got a lot more to say about orchids, and we'll come back to them. But I wanted to just spend a bit of time on some other interesting plants. These stylidiums are characterized by this loaded column. It's under tension. And when an insect, a potential pollinator, lands on the lower petal, that triggers the column to snap forward and dab it with pollen. They've timed this trigger action. It takes 15 milliseconds. So the insect doesn't have a chance to fly away before it's dusted with pollen. And once it's triggered, over about half an hour, it resets itself and is ready for the next insect. And once again, we have a large group of plants that are easy to recognize by these loaded columns. They come in a variety of growth habits. Interestingly, the leaves are always interesting, and they're often quite beautiful. On this one, the tips of the leaves are curled, and the plant uses those curled leaves to climb other plants. There's lots of them, more than 150 species in Western Australia alone. And again, most of them are not in the books. There's just too many, so we have a lot of Stylidium spa designations, but they're all beautiful and easily recognized as Stylidiums. So the stamen and the style are fused. So notice over here the ripe pollen So initially, a visiting insect will be dusted with pollen. Then later, the stigma will develop, and from then on, it will pick up pollen from the visiting insects. I watched these small bees landing on the flowers and literally getting trapped. But what I found interesting was that bee, although it couldn't get out of there, it didn't struggle. It seemed to know that if it just waited a bit, the plant would release it. And that's what happened. But it seemed to be a pretty literally hit and miss proposition. It seems like insects would be pollinated more by accident than anything else. But on the other hand, it has been successful in, that's easy to see by the great diversity of plants that have this feature. I mentioned the sundews earlier, and this is a really interesting group of plants in Western Australia. As I'm sure you know, the sundews trap insects with sticky hairs on the leaves. The genus name Drosera is Greek for dewy, pretty appropriate. In British Columbia, we have 3 species of sundews. Western Australia has 113 species. And while our 3 all have very uninteresting small white flowers, some of the flowers in Western Australia are quite spectacular. Somehow the plant contrives to attract different insects as pollinators and prey. It's not clear to me how exactly that works, but it wouldn't, in the long run, it wouldn't do for you to eat your pollinators. But these flowers are also capable of self-pollination. If they don't get pollinated during the day, the anther and the stigma are brought together as the flower closes in the evening, and they pollinate themselves. Some Droseras are able to achieve a lifespan of 50 years. The genus is worldwide, but the heaviest concentration of species occurs in Australia, and particularly in Southwest Australia, the area that we're visiting. There are some species are annuals, and they're characterized by numerous flowers which produce copious amounts of seed. The perennial species have fewer flowers because they don't need as much seed. So you got to wonder why so many species of sundews in Western Australia. And that has to do with the fact that Western Australia has been geologically stable for many millions of years. There's been no volcanic action. There's been no glaciation. So the soils are ancient and they're nutrient poor. The soils here have, for example, half the amount of nitrogen as soils in comparable climates on other continents. Now, sundews have evolved to get their nutrients from insects. They don't rely on soil-bound nutrients. And so they are able to grow in areas where other plants that would otherwise outcompete them can't survive. And that's the reason why we've got such a diversity of species. Also, such a long time has given genus lots of time to evolve new species. For example, this one has very large, thick leaves that lay flat on the ground, obviously designed to trap larger ground beetles. And then there's a separate group called pygmy sundews, which are tiny plants, only an inch tall, but the flower is still full size. It's got to have that full size flower to attract the pollinator. And here's another one that is climbing 10 feet up a tree. And it's using its sticky leaves to enable it to do that. By climbing other plants, it saves the sundew the energy of producing its own tall, stiff stem. So the plants seem to climb as high as possible. And when they can't go any higher, that's when they open their flowers. Presumably, they get the flowers up high so that they are accessible and visible to insect pollinators. There's a group of insects that are immune to the sticky glands on the sundew hairs. These insects actually feed on insects that are trapped by the sundew. But the sundew accommodates them. You got to wonder why. Point is that the sundew beetle eats the trapped insect, digests it, and then leaves behind its own feces. So what that means to the plant is that it has now got a partially digested meal. So the plant is actually gaining from the attentions of these seemingly thieving beetles. I just wanted to briefly mention Stirling Range Park. You see it down in the lower right in blue. The mountains in this park are 1 million years old. The park is only 700 square miles, but so far they've identified 1,500 species of plants, 60 of which only occur in the park. So this Southwest Botanical Province, as you can see by the numerous dots on the plant guide, had many, many places of interest. And it was here for the first time we encountered Banksias. They're named for Sir Joseph Banks, who visited Australia with Captain Cook on Cook's first voyage of discovery. He later became a moving force in botany in Britain. He was the director of Kew Gardens, but he maintained a lifelong connection with Australia. Linnaeus named Banksia, and Linnaeus even proposed Banksia as a name for Australia. There's about 175 species of Banksias, all but one of them are endemic to Australia. And their growth habit ranges from prostrate, like this one, the flower cluster, that flower cluster is about 8 inches high, and it's laying right on the ground. And from there, the species go up to trees that are 90 feet tall. We weren't there at the best time of year for Banksias, but there were some of interest. You can see that each flower head has hundreds and hundreds of individual flowers. And that makes the Banksias an important food source for all sorts of nectariferous animals, including birds, bats, rats, possums, stingless bees, and a host of invertebrates, a host of insects. But of all those hundreds of flowers, only a few of them will produce seeds. I don't understand why, but I have not come across an explanation for that. And it's quite possible that nobody understands it. But the fruit is a woody follicle, which you can see in the lower right. The bumps represent the fertilized flowers. And in this old one, the gaps show where the seeds have been released. And for many of the banksias, the seeds are released only when they're exposed to fire. And as I say, this is a fairly recent realization in Australia that these plants have grown, have evolved in an arid area. They've evolved in association with fire. And it's now known that at least 400 species require or depend on smoke for seed germination. So now, as I say, fairly recently, they have started a program of prescribed burns. Here's an area that has gone unburned for way too long. It's overgrown, but directly opposite, on the opposite side of the road, is an area that was burned the previous year, and now the understory is exposed to the light. Plants are already regrowing. New banksias sprout either from underground roots or from seeds that are released by fire. And there'll be many other herbaceous things that will also come up in short order. Another area that was burned recently shows a profusion of hibiscus flowers. There's just thousands of these beautiful big flowers. The large plants in the foreground with the black trunks show that they have been through fire probably numerous times. Because of the black trunks, these used to be called black boys, but these days that's not politically correct. So now they're called grass trees, which is a pretty good name too. Right here, we have an explosion of pea plants 1 year after a fire. A previous mass bloom has laid down an enormous seed bank. And so the next time the light reaches the ground after a fire, we have this explosion of flowers. There are so many different species of peas that they're absolutely impossible to even begin to try to identify. Western Australia has about 90 genera with perhaps 650 species, but again, that's just an estimate. From one of these species, they have extracted a poison called 1080. The native animals have evolved along with this plant, and they're immune to the poison in the plant. But introduced animals are not immune. Introduced animals are killed by it. So this poison is widely used to try to control problem introductions like rats and rabbits and such. So it's toxic to the introduced animals, and they use these baits of 1080 quite widely, and you frequently see warning signs. So keep your dog away from that area. Once again, the peas show every growth habit. There's some herbs, but mostly there's shrubs, vines, or trees. They're all beautiful flowers. Peas are really good insect flowers. They produce copious amounts of nectar. Now, this is not a donkey orchid, but that this reminds me of something. Let's go back and look at the donkey orchids for a second. If we look at the center of the donkey orchid, we have a pea flower. Now, most orchids provide no nectar, but the donkey orchids are tricking insects into visiting them because they think they're peas and have lots of nectar. There's some beautiful forest down there too. This is a Kerry forest, eucalyptus trees. And we ran into the stubby-tailed skink. You notice that the tail resembles the head. When they're threatened, they form this C shape. And so the predator, there's a 50-50 chance that the predator will go for the tail, which the animal can regrow, instead of grabbing the animal by the head, which is bad news for the skink. You've no doubt heard of goannas. This is a variation of iguana, which the early settlers thought they resembled. There's over 20 species of goannas in Australia, and one of which reaches 6 feet. That's a pretty intimidating lizard. Spitfire caterpillars are covered with toxic hairs, which will cause a burning rash if they're touched. And here's my friend Dave with literally miles of white sandy tropical beach and no one else in sight. I've been frustrated in seeing birds that I couldn't get anywhere near, but I finally found some that were friendly, really friendly. So this gave me a chance to get good close-ups. At one point, I'm walking along with a camera in one hand with a macro lens on it. I hear a buzzing next to my shoulder, and here is a hoverfly. So I just raised the camera and managed to take a picture before it literally buzzed off. But I was amazed when I looked at the fly on the computer. We're looking at the back end of it and we're seeing an exaggerated face. Those big eyes, even the back legs are held up like antennae. So presumably a bird swooping in on this from behind might be intimidated by this face. Some more of the kangaroo paws. These are of interest because of the flower shape indicates that they are bird pollinated. So they're wide open and easily accessible to birds. In the foreground, there's a grass tree. It's called belga, which is the Aboriginal name for the plant. When these things flower, they send up a flower spike that can be 7 feet tall. And I don't know who counted them, but the literature says there can be 10,000 flowers on this spike, and 350 invertebrates have been recorded using the plant. And you only have to spend a very few minutes watching one of these flower spikes to realize that that's probably a good estimate. There's a lot of insects coming to these flowers. So a little more about orchids. I love the center of this one. It's just so beautiful. Now, the sun orchids are unusual in that the lip is the same as all the other petals. Most orchids have a very different lip. They're also remarkable because generally blue orchids are rare, but they're called sun orchids because they tend to open only in the sun. They close at night or in cloudy weather. As it turns out that we happen to be in the area where they were growing in a period of cloudy weather. And so although we saw these big blue buds, we knew what they were, but we couldn't see the flowers. This was getting frustrated. These guys are self-pollinated, so they don't need to open. But the sun finally came out and I managed to get my pictures. A few more of the many, many donkey orchids. This one's called the bird orchid. The rabbit orchid. So we've seen donkey orchids, rabbit orchids, bird orchids, spider orchids. What animal would you expect this is named for? Yeah, you're right. It's a snail orchid. How many caladienias are there? One author says 40 and another 40 species, another says 120. And that's just an indication of the flux that Australian botany is in. It's no wonder there's confusion because plants that are now considered caladienias look so different. And not only that, there can be very small differences. Notice the fringes on the edge of the petals of this plant. Another species is identical, except that it doesn't have the fringes. But how do you deal with that? I think of all the orchids, this is my favorite, the Cossack dancer. Such a perfect name for it. It just looks so much like a Cossack dancer. I just love it. So the glands on the lip are called calli, and that's where caladienia comes from. Caladienia means beautiful glands. Most of the caladienias are pollinated by sexually attracted male wasps. The dark maroon color and the dark calli are visual equivalents to a female wasp. But in addition, the calli produce sexual attractants, imitation pheromones. The brownish clubs on the petals also produce pheromones, and the hairs help to disperse the scent. So different species produce different attractants. And that means, so in other words, the different species are producing different pseudo pheromones. And that means that each species is attracting one single species of pollinator, one species of wasp. And that's very advantageous to the plants because pollen is scattered around, it's pretty inefficient. But if you have a dedicated pollinator, it's going from you to only to another flower that's related, that's going to be receptive to the pollen you're carrying. But within a species, different plants produce slightly different pheromones and indicating different females. So the bees don't get a chance to learn to recognize the artificial pheromones because they're continually changing just slightly. So they've done an experiment. A Caladinia flower placed in a new location attracts a male wasp within 1 to 3 minutes. The new odor represents a freshly emerged female, and the fastest male is going to be the most successful. This flower is pollinated by a large black wasp, which lands on the lip, and the movement of the wasp, of the male wasp, flapping its wings, causes the flower to flip. The pollen is held up in here, so the male wasp is flipped upside down and picks up the pollen on its back. Caladinia. And these plants also hybridize, so it's more complications. This is the lip of the so-called hammer orchid because it looks and moves like a hammer. Now, what's important is to note here is this hinge. So we've got a simulated female wasp on the lip of the flower. This genus only occurs in this corner of Australia. There's 10 species. They're endemic to this area, and that's dangerous. So as I indicated, they're pollinated by sexual deception of male wasps. Now this is called king and his carriage. So you've got to recognize the king wearing a hood here. Here's his hands holding the reins and his horse out in front, king and his carriage. So the females of these wasps are flightless. When they're ready to mate, they crawl to the top of a grass stem and release their pheromone. A male wasp will swoop down, snatch them off the grass, they mate in flight, and then the male drops her back to the ground and she goes off and lays eggs. So the lip here looks like a female wasp. It gives off the same pheromone. The pollen in this case is in here in the hood, as you can see. And this unfortunately is not my picture, but it shows what happens. The male wasp grasps what it thinks is the female and tries to fly away with it. But when it takes off, when it starts flapping its wings, this hinge causes him to flip upside down and bang into the pollen. And he will do that repeatedly, back and forth and back and forth. So he gets a good load of pollen. But then he'll go off and repeat the same performance at another flower. They just can't learn. So this plant has another good English name. It's called the flying duck orchid. And these are tiny. You may not be able to see it, but the plant I'm photographing is right down here. In this case, the column is under tension. It's loaded like those trigger plants we saw earlier. The pollen is down in here. Yeah, there's the pollinia down there. So when a male wasp grasps the what it thinks is a female, it releases the trigger, the column, which flips it again upside down, slams it into the pollen. And the male wasp will eventually give up and fly off to the next plant. So this was one of the most interesting and intriguing plants of this whole trip. And I just thought that that was a good one to wind up with. So we traveled over 4,500 miles. And as I said earlier, this was by far the best plant hunting trip that I've had. So thank you for staying awake.
Staying awake was no problem at all. That was fascinating.
It's good.
I can't believe how sneaky some of those plants are. But sneaky in a good way, because obviously that's how they keep propagating.
Good for the plant.
Oh, absolutely. It's really quite incredible, the things that they've come up with.
You know, what's interesting to speculate on is what would happen if those plants went extinct? What effect would that have on the insects?
No kidding.
It would have no effect at all, because insects are getting nothing out of this.
Well,
Absolutely
you're
nothing.
right, Dan. Yeah, you're quite right. They're not. Yeah.
It's-
Plants are getting all of the the benefits there. Yeah, no, you're quite right. That was really interesting about the plants that needed fire and smoke.
Mhm.
That was, I mean, obviously, I think we all know that a lot of plants regenerate after wildfires, but plants that actually need the fire and the smoke was something that I hadn't really been aware of. I had a question from the very, very beginning of your presentation, not about plants. That great long truck, what on earth were they carrying?
Well, it's just like they would be carrying various different cargoes. It's just like one of our 18 wheelers, but with 3 or 4 40-foot trailers behind it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the thing was huge. I just wondered what it was, what it might be carrying.
Yeah, it could be anything from general cargo to ore from mines. Outside of the towns, they have special assembly yards. Of course, you can't drive a thing that big through a town, so the trucks and trailers are brought individually to these assembly yards, and the road train is put together on the edge of town.
Oh, that's interesting.
This is an interesting place. I highly recommend it as a place to visit.
Oh, it looks absolutely wonderful. And when I was first looking at your different things that you were suggesting for the presentation, the Western Australia thing got me in a couple of ways, partly because I like the whole idea of the chasing wild orchids. But the other thing is that our late fearless leader, Tom,
Yes.
went to Australia every second year, pretty much. He never said he went to Australia. He always said, I'm going to Western Australia.
Yes.
And everything that you got from Tom, photos or anything while he was gone, it was always from Tom in Western Australia. So it made me think about him too, which is kind of neat.
Yeah.
I don't see any.
No doubt he was looking at the birds there. So my big deal about the splendid wren was probably old news to you guys.
No, I haven't seen that before. That was absolutely gorgeous.
You mean I found something that Tom missed? Wow.
Well, he didn't share all that many photos.
Oh,
He really didn't. He'd send the odd photo from Australia, but he didn't share all that many. So I had never seen that splendid wren. That was absolutely beautiful and an absolutely perfect name.
yes,
I noticed a lot of those plants had perfect names.
yeah.
Yeah, that was quite neat. I see there are a couple of things on the chat here. I can get them to come up here. Hello.
Armin and Jim are here.
Oh, sorry. Valerie's just saying, thank you. The photos are wonderful and your presentation very informative.
Thank you.
Carol Pan, wonderful presentation, enjoyed very much. And Mary Savage, thank you, Ron, an amazing presentation. And Audrey's asking, what was the temperature range?
Comfortable. It was spring. We were there for 7 weeks from the middle of September to towards the end of October, which is spring. So it was short sleeves, lightweight clothes. I certainly don't recommend anybody wears either shorts or sandals there.
No.
You're going to regret it, particularly if you're out there looking for plants.
Yeah, I guess with all of the, not only do we have prickly stuff there, but we have poisonous snakes and insects and,
Yeah.
and even the plants are poisonous.
We never saw a snake.
No, that was lucky.
Yeah, I think the snakes are smarter than we are. They see, they know we're coming and they get out of the way. I've never had an encounter with a snake anywhere in Africa and South America. Never.
Really?
Yeah.
Good Lord.
I don't even think about them.
Well, I haven't
I
had
hit
any
that.
close encounters with them, but well, not really close, but my sister and I went to visit my brother when he had a house in Sedona, which he recently sold. But the first day that we went for a hike, we just got started on the trail, and right across the trail in front of us was a great big snake.
Yeah.
And the friend of theirs was with us, while we were trying to hold her back, she's sneaking up trying to get a good photo so she could identify it as one of the most poisonous snakes in Arizona. Thank you very much.
I've seen more rattlesnakes in California than in any of these other countries that are supposed to be so dangerous. So,
Yeah.
Don't you think the plus means talk?
Sure.
Yes.
There's a lot of strings. Take those.
Hi, can you hear me?
yes.
Is it? Oh, okay. It's Armin and Jim. Thank you so much for sharing all your amazing photos and explaining that your narration was fantastic too. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we got a few more questions here. Are there more orchids in West Australia than anywhere else? I
don't know the answer to that, but it would be a very good bet.
Yeah.
I've been to South Africa looking at plants, and that's a similar kind of environment in that it has very ancient geology, but we saw very few orchids there. So I think that Western Australia could be the winner in that competition.
Mm-hmm. Sharon Jones from the White Rock Surrey group is asking if there are biting insects or mosquitoes.
No, we weren't aware of them at all. We were never bothered by mosquitoes. Ants would be more of a problem. When you're laying on the ground. I can't say that it was a big problem, but that's the only biting insect that could possibly be a nuisance. Now, during the wet, it could be a completely different story. But you wouldn't want to go there in the wet anyway.
I wouldn't think so, no. Looking at those posts they put up to show how deep the water is you're going to be driving through, didn't look like my idea of a good time.
Are we almost?
Annie has a comment here too. She's saying, what a different venture than the Pink Mountain presentations. I connect with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's all about flowers,
Yeah.
which have been my big thing for, well, going back to the 70s is when I first got interested in wildflowers. But I'm running out of places to go to find accessible wildflowers. There are still places I'd like to do, but I'm too old now to climb mountains and get to them. So believe it or not, I've now branched out into photographing birds, which at least in South America are much more accessible. But that's another story for another time.
Annie's saying, have you gone to Botany Valley out of Lytton?
No, I have, I'm very familiar with it. I've been hearing about it almost from the beginning, but I have found virtually all of the plants that grow in Botany Valley in other locations. And it's a little bit out of the way, so I just have not had enough motivation to make the effort to get there.
You had some other interesting things in your presentation, along with all of the plants and some of those birds. The bit about the kangaroos, people, checking the kangaroos that have been hit by cars to see if they had joeys. I thought that was really interesting that people would actually make that effort to do that.
Yes, and it's amazing how often we encountered people. We went into one visitor center and the lady there had a little bag filled with towels, and she had a tiny kangaroo that she had brought to work with her. It's just quite wonderful. But when you get to know the animals, you can see why.
Yeah.
They're beautiful animals.
Yeah, they look like really lovely animals.
Looks like they domesticate pretty well. They're raised from an infant.
Does anyone have more questions for Ron or comments, apart from how wonderful this was?
Just one thing, I was wondering, have you explored other parts of Australia, Ron?
I have not, no. I would like to go back, but there isn't any other part of Australia that has the plant diversity. I'm thinking though that,
The Northern Territories?
well, I would like to see the north, but that is going to be more for the geography. I think they have some pretty spectacular rock formations and such. And Eastern Australia, I think, could be an interesting birding area. And so something that I will be looking into is if there is any particular birding guides that to help in that respect. But
Well,
otherwise, there's too many people.
Well, the Northern Territories aren't very populated, and they
Yes.
had some fascinating plants that we were introduced to when we were there.
Oh.
And one of them is a grass that, well, they discovered this grass because they tried to bring sheep into the Northern Territories. The grass would get embedded in the wool and then would burrow into the animal and kill it.
Oh, for God's sake. Wow.
Devil's grass. And the guy who was our guide, he picked up some, and I don't know if he put water on it or what he did, but it started to move in his hand. It was incredible.
For God's sakes. Did you see any flowering plants up there?
Yeah, we did actually quite a few, but I'm not a botanist, so I couldn't identify them, just that they were, remarkable in their colors.
Yeah, yeah.
See,
It's
we have
definitely an area I'd like to see. That's the trouble with getting old. There's too many things left to do.
And we
Well,
have
you need
another
a bucket
question
list.
here. We have a question from Molly, otherwise known as Valerie Fuller. Would any of the orchids which rely on on specific insects to pollinate them become extinct if the wasp became extinct?
Valerie Fuller.
I suspect they would.
No, that's,
Would.
Oh, sorry.
it's not Molly either. It's Audrey or something.
In terms of evolution,
Valerie Fuller
they
was
would-
taller.
those frogs would die out.
It's speaking earlier.
Jim and Armin here are giving you a big thumbs up there.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
hear me? Well, when I'm not much of a botanist, but when Jim and I are walking around our neighborhood in Beech Grove, he found an app that he put on his iPhone, and he aims it at a flower and or some berries or whatever, and it identifies it.
It's called Picture This on an Apple iPhone.
So I was wondering if they had that like in Western Australia, if you didn't have a guide, but you could aim your iPhone at it and it would tell you the name of the flower. So I don't know. I just know it's fun when we're in our own neighborhood or Centennial Beach or something, we identify a flower, grass or things like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's pretty cool. Picture this.
That and something like that would be very helpful, but that's a relatively recent innovation here, and I don't think that it even existed when we were in Australia. But boy, what a big job to create that app for Australia.
Yeah.
No kidding.
But even if you're just a novice like me,
Yeah.
or sometimes we know the name, but we can't remember it. That's another one.
Ain't that
So
the-
it's fun to just aim it at it and say, oh yeah, that's a wild strawberry or something. So anyway, it's fun.
yeah, no kidding.
I hope I haven't missed any questions here. No, I don't think so. Anyone else have anything more before we let Ron go?
Well, I
No?
sure appreciate you being here, folks. I really enjoy your group. You're always so enthusiastic, and I hope the next time I see you, it will be live.
I hope so too. I hope so too, Ron.
A big thank you.
Okay, thanks again.
Thank you.
So everyone,
It's
next
great.
meeting, next meeting, September 6th, our first hybrid Zoom meeting, so we'll see how that goes. And Terry Carr is going to present on butterflies and other bugs of Delta. So that should be interesting. And since Carol and Paul are offering up their home for a summer party, we'll have to talk about that, and we'll see what we can come up with for the summer. Sure sounds like a great idea. So
Okay.
good night, everyone, and until we are in touch again about a summer party, enjoy your summer.